Good day. This is Linda Kilt, and I just wanted to spend some time talking about the assignments that are due and have been due for lesson ones, two, and three for the course, as it seems quite confusing about what is expected and what is needed and what some of the due dates are. So I just wanted to clarify that and give you some examples and review some of the materials that will help you with your comparisons across countries. So the major assignment that is actually due in lesson three, which is not due until October 6th, is this three nation comparison assignment. So what you're learning in lesson one and lesson two will build to and be a foundation for this major lesson three assignment coming up. So let's first talk about um, some of the comparative methods that we learned about in the class. In lesson one, we learned about some of the methods of comparison or some of the approaches that can be used. In the first one, this general comparative method is very broad-based and looks at the related approaches, strategies, and policies across countries. It includes looking at the legal basis for policies, such as their legal system or their constitution, their strategies as it relates to national security or terrorism and counterterrorism or dealing with natural disasters, critical infrastructure protection, etc. Their institutions, primarily their government institutions that are dealing with the security issues and specific policies around a homeland security or security issue that they're addressing. So that's a general comparative method. It's very, very broad and and certainly can cover a broad range of homeland security topics. So very easy, not easy to use, but again, it's very comprehensive and is fairly easy to remember and understand. Another approach that was addressed in lesson one is this risk assessment approach. It looks at how nations address a specific risk or threat, whether that threat is caused by a natural disaster, such as a hurricane or drought, to terrorism, whether it's domestic or international, or pandemics of some kind, how they might deal with critical infrastructure protection or cyber warfare, cybersecurity. You can look at addressing and looking at nations at a specific risk and how they're addressing it. And then you can also look at how nations are addressing this risk or threat over time. And this concept of over time, it could be over a very long period, from 10 to 50 years, to a short time period from 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. The challenge is when you do any type of time analysis is the ability to find documentation across multiple nations over a period of time and finding specific policies and strategies over that period of time. In addition, in the risk assessment approach, you have to analyze how and why a specific risk is selected to become a security issue within a nation. And oftentimes, a risk is selected because of a major focusing event, whether it's natural or man-made. For example, 9/11 was a major focusing event for the United States that really led to the rise of the Homeland Security state and enterprise as a result of the 9/11 attacks. In Europe, a major focusing event has been international terrorist attacks on buses and trains, and so the focus has been on critical infrastructure security around mass transit systems. And so you might look at, how is this risk selected, and was there some type of major event that really formulated and motivated elected officials to address it through creating new policies and procedures and laws. And then also with the risk assessment approach, we also read about culture theory. And so it asks, how do different cultures perceive risks? And this is the work of, Ella Wildavsky talked a great deal about culture and risk in a number of his articles. And so, when you live in different countries and cultures, will look at risk differently. and they will respond to risk differently. And so, how does culture influence the strategies selected to mitigate risks or prevent threats? For example, in Israel, I guarantee you how they perceive terrorism might be very different than how it might be perceived in Canada. And so it's very different to look at, use culture theory and understand how different cultures perceive risks, how do they respond to them, and how do they prevent those types of things. And so the next area of comparison approach is the securitization approach. This approach looks at how a security problem emerged and was resolved or dissolved. It went away over time. And again, a security problem such as, for example, domestic terrorism could have emerged as a result of disenfranchised groups or individuals that did not feel that perhaps the political system was meeting their needs or honoring and respecting their rights. And perhaps the country dealt with it through new laws and policies protecting the civil liberties of other people. And so then that particular domestic terrorism risk was resolved and went away because the needs of individuals were addressed through laws and policy. The securitization approach also asks, how do nations address different sets of homeland security problems over time? And again, over time, if you're asking about how does a nation address lone wolf terrorism, for example, or you're talking about how it's looked at that issue over a period of 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, you can, again, look at it in any way you want. It's an issue of, if you do that, where do I find the information and can I get that information? And then why is, and another thing with the securitization approach, it asks, why is one or the same risk of a threat that is present addressed as a homeland security issue in one country and not another? So you might see some security threats that are heavily addressed in one nation but not in another. And it could be, well, that threat is not relevant or not a major problem in one country over another. And so identifying how some countries are addressing some threats and not others is another interesting question that's part of the securitization approach. In lesson 1, you had an assignment which was basically a lit review of 4 articles. So there was lots of readings in lesson 1, and your job was to identify and review 4 of the titles from that lesson that were reading assignments, and basically do a lit review of those 4 articles, including a biographical citation, and then you were to discuss in the paper the types of comparison that was done, the methods used, the results reached, and your own assessment of what you thought of the methods that were used and the relevance of the results to help you understand the practical problems of homeland security, and perhaps even what you learned that can be applied to homeland security policy in the United States. Now, this should have been a 4 to 5 page paper using APA citations, and you can obviously use this information as in your lit review as part of your next assignments in lesson 2 and in lesson 3. Now, in lesson 2, there's a number of concepts that are probably fairly new to most of us. This idea of transversal aspects. And the easiest way, I think, to understand it is understand some of the examples of them. And so a transversal aspect, if you look at Homeland Security as a system or a large-scale enterprise, an aspect is something that transcends and goes across the entire system. Oftentimes, you find them across multiple nations. And so in this case, we are provided in this lesson examples from the United States, and it's from the Homeland Security Strategy and the missions statements that we have. So one of the transversal aspects is preventing terrorism and enhancing security. Another is securing and managing our borders. Another is enforcing and administering our immigration laws. Another is safeguarding and securing cyberspace. And the last is ensuring resilience to disasters. A number of these transversal aspects are also common in in the European Union as well. And so the assignment dealt with select one transversal aspect and address it and across a specific framework. And one of the frameworks that was addressed had to do with this particular framework called the comprehensive approach. So in the assignment, you're asked to take one transversal aspect and put it in this comprehensive approach. And so the comprehensive approach basically is based off of the phases of emergency management. And the phases include mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. In some approaches, it includes prevention. In the United States, it includes prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And when you look at each of those elements, you'll have to also look at how our in our response efforts, for example, how are resources, capabilities, and capacities deployed, and how are actors coordinated, how is the private sector, the government sector, and nonprofit sector coordinated in terms of responding to a specific disaster? Who are the actors and what strategies basically guide our response, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness efforts? So those are the questions I would ask. And so let's perhaps go through an example of how I might address this assignment. So in this particular case, you're asked, let's go to the assignment. You're asked draft your own analytical framework for a three-nation comparison based on the comprehensive approach. So you want to basically identify three nations. Number one, in this case, I'm going to select the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. And I would highly recommend that if you're doing a three-nation comparison, always include the United States and also include two nations that you would find and use that in the Morag textbook, because that way you have countries that have talked about and great information about some of these aspects already available in your textbook. And so I'm going to use the comprehensive approach and focus on one of the transversal aspects and upload it in the lesson. So in my case, let's go back to our comprehensive approach and our transversal aspects. So in my paper, my transversal aspect that I'm selecting is ensuring resilience to disasters. And the specific disaster that I want to focus in on is the disaster related to an Ebola pandemic. And I'm specifically concerned about Ebola because it's currently a threat in the Congo where over 2,000 people have already died over the last 18 months. Ebola is one of the deadliest pandemics that we could possibly face. And we've faced that crisis in the past, and it's likely to occur again, given the way the virus is mutating and becoming more and more deadly. So using this framework as well as this aspect, I can raise a whole bunch of questions that I would like to answer in my paper and in my question. So some of the things using this framework I would ask around pandemics would be related to, first of all, again, my countries are the US, Great Britain, and France. And my first question is, well, how do these countries mitigate, respond to, and recover from an Ebola pandemic? What is their strategy? Do they have pandemic strategies, or do they have something specific to an Ebola pandemic? What laws and policies are in place in each country that would address a large-scale catastrophic pandemic? What are their resources, capabilities, and capacities to deal with a large-scale public health crisis like Ebola? How do they coordinate government, private sector, and communities to prevent an outbreak, to be prepared for an outbreak, and to respond and to recover from a pandemic such as Ebola? Do they have a recovery plan? And how is this related to resilience is by having more of these questions answered, the more they can show preparedness and mitigation and their ability to respond and recover shows that they're resilient to disasters, right? Because their goal is to mitigate hazards, enhance preparedness, ensure effective emergency response, and rapid recovery. Um, so I'm actually also looking, when I'm doing this questioning, I'm using a general comparative method where I'm specifically looking at the different approaches of each country, the large-scale national strategies of each country, the specific policies across countries as it relates to catastrophic pandemics. So I'm looking at only one threat. Um, and so that is how I would want to handle that specific assignment. And you can be very specific on what you want to address. It's really up to you and what your interests are. Is just explain why you selected that transversal aspect and why those countries. And we're using the comprehensive approach again in addressing each one of those elements. So here's what you gotta do for lesson 2 assignment. It's not due until September 22nd, so you have some time. So you should, again, select this aspect and tell me why you selected it, give reasons for the nations that you selected, and then you draft your analytical framework to guide your comparison of the effects of the transversal aspect on the homeland security policies. So my transversal aspect had to deal with um, resilience. And so for me, the greater the resilience of a nation, obviously, the less likely they're going to have higher rates of death due to a pandemic. And so I can prove the higher levels of resilience based off of how well they can prevent a pandemic from occurring, how well they can mitigate it from happening, how well they can respond to it and recover from such an event. So that clearly shows levels of resilience. And then your idea is here is to draft a framework, but not quite apply it. You don't have to yet get to the point where you're doing detailed research, but you should at least be able to add a few considerations about the main commonalities and differences across the three nations. For example, I know in the US, Great Britain, and Canada, they basically have national pandemic policies that follow the World Health Organization's framework for dealing with pandemics. But how they deal with pandemics, including the public health framework, is different across those nations because their public health systems are so different. And so that is where you're going to find differences in this particular scenario. So being able to identify a few of those commonalities and differences is going to be useful for this assignment. Now, to help you with this assignment, um, it's I would like you to basically create a voice thread by the 16th of September so you can get feedback for this assignment by your peers. So before turning in the paper assignment, that before turning in your paper assignment, you're able to get some uh, peer feedback. So even though it says a short presentation, the primary work is going to be a paper assignment where you draft your assignment and then you basically create a PowerPoint or you can create a one-page paper, put it on VoiceThread by the 16th of September. I ask that you provide feedback to your peers by the 20th of September and that you make any modifications and turn in your final paper product by September 22nd. So that's your lesson 2 assignment. And then for lesson 3, building on what you have learned in these previous weeks, you'll be choosing and applying a framework for a 3-nation comparison. Again, like I said, the comparison should include the United States and 2 nations from the Morag textbook. And you should be writing a complete research paper that does a 3-country comparison of a homeland security issue. And again, this issue can be anything from how they might deal with a specific type of natural disaster like a drought or a tsunami or hurricane or any other type of event or terrorism or pandemic. They should also include a list of the nations compared and why they were selected. You should explain the transversal aspect addressed and why. Again, this was from lesson 2. Explain and justify the framework that you used. And then next, compare and contrast the strategies. Normally, I would look at the national strategies, policies, laws, and organizations across nations that are specifically addressing this homeland security issue. And then analyze and explain your results, like when you do a comparison and contrast, where are they the same? Where are they different? And outlook, meaning, is the outlook good in terms of do they have sound policies and procedures, and have they been effective in reducing terrorism or responding to terrorism? And then explain the lessons learned for the United States from this analysis. What can we learn about our own homeland security policies, for example, in terms of making modifications or perhaps making them better? Now, this should be a 5 to 7 page paper using APA formatting, including a list of references in APA formatting. Now, this 5 to 7 page paper is due on October 6th. And what I would like you to do is present a preliminary draft of your findings using VoiceThread. Again, this can be a short PowerPoint, one paper document where or a Excel spreadsheet showing the comparison very briefly, but I would like that you show your preliminary findings by September 30th. And you respond to your colleagues by the 3rd of October. And that way you can use the input from your colleagues to enhance your paper and to make any modifications to your paper. So that is a little bit of a highlight of the assignments. And if you have any questions, you can contact me. Thank you very much.